One of the most interesting questions that no one has yet clearly explained is what caused the decline of the medieval Camino de Santiago, where it changed from being traveled by tens of thousands of people each year to just a few dozen pilgrims a few centuries later. In a previous video, we explained that the Camino de Santiago did not arise from devotion to the saint, but rather from the alignment of political and economic interests of the Spanish kingdoms, who wanted to first halt the Muslim advance and then expel the invaders from the peninsula, with the interests of the Church in Rome, who were displeased with the ideas promoted by the Toledan Church. In this video, I'm going to dive deep into the reasons behind the decline in popularity of the route. I'll cite and analyze the validity of some popular arguments, and I'll also add in causes that other authors haven't considered. This is Aventuras a pie de página, and I'm Esteban, your guide for today. This video is based on my book, Ultreia Suseia et Magia, now available in English and Spanish in our Ko-Fi page. We resume our chronology at the beginning of the 14th century. The reconquest of Spain advanced smoothly, and the route continues to grow in popularity. However, events occur in this century that will slow down the growth in popularity of the pilgrimage. The first event happened at the beginning of the century, the end of the medieval optimum climate. The medieval optimum climate was a period with a particularly warm and stable climate that benefited northern Europe, allowing good harvests and food abundance, and which curiously started in 850, almost coinciding with the discovery of the Apostles' Tomb. This century won't experience bad weather, but it won't have a climate as stable and wonderful as the centuries before. Another event will be the start of the 100 Years' War between France and England. This will cause a cooling down in the land pilgrimages of the English pilgrims, and then it will boost pilgrimages by ship, which are considerably shorter and less expensive, reducing the journey from 4 exhausting months to only 21 semi-relaxed days for a round-trip journey. Furthermore, it will improve trade between England and Coruña. This change in the duration of the pilgrimage will result in a shift in the perceptions of pilgrims in Galicia. Generally, when the pilgrims on foot arrived in Galicia, they were already quite exhausted and broke, having most of them run out of funds due to the long journey. Imagine if even now in modern times it's complicated to make a good budget for the Camino. Back then it was an impossible task, being most people non-travelers without education nor information. These new short-distance pilgrims, having traveled only for a few days, arrived in Santiago quite rested and well-funded, which will make them more appealing to the Galician merchants. Sanctuaries in the vicinity started to be promoted through songs or cantigas to attract this type of pilgrim. Among these sanctuaries are Finisterre, Muxia, Padrón, and perhaps St. Andrew of Teixido, although the latter sanctuary was not fully integrated into the Camino itineraries. Nevertheless, these songs would be more effective in attracting a new type of pilgrim, the adventurous pilgrim, which begins to emerge in the late 15th century, and we will discuss later in the video. In order to understand the events of the coming centuries, it's important to have a general perspective of Europe and the world. The most important event was the rise and normalization of the Mongol Empire that would allow the trade of luxury goods between East Asia and Western Europe. This was helped by the publication in the year 1300 of Marco Polo's adventures across Asia, detailing all the wealth of the Mongol Empire. This book was translated into multiple languages and was a huge success, and even more so, considering that it was written and distributed in an era before the printing press. Furthermore, the other important events of this century are the plagues of the Black Death. These will cause the movement of people to cool down. Also, it caused the collapse of the Mongol Empire in 1368. A side effect related to the fall of the Mongol Empire was the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which later cut the trade of luxury goods to Europe, forcing European nations to seek alternatives. In the early 1400s, the Little Ice Age kicks off. This era is defined by colder temperatures and unstable weather, alternating floods with droughts. This situation will wreak havoc on food production throughout Europe, leading to immense poverty and starvation over the next 450 years. Some of those poor people trying to escape hunger will resort to pilgrim assistance networks to find food and shelter, altering the demographics of the Camino. It must be said that this polar era doesn't affect the whole continent equally, and it took several decades for its effects to be seen on the peninsula, reaching us news from the year 1475 as the first consequences. Another historical event would be the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in 1450, which greatly facilitated the distribution of pamphlets and books. In the final decades of the 15th century, a demographic shift begins to be noticed in the routes and ambience of the pilgrimage, which becomes less religious. This demographic change encompasses not only an increase in beggars and vagrants, but also inclusion of their female counterparts, as the Camino until then was mostly walked by men. The increase in vagrants and beggars is going to cause reputational damage of the pilgrims and of the Camino. However, infrastructure kept being built, including the opening of new hospitals. And so we arrived at the year 1492, where seismic events will occur for the future of the route, of Spain, and of the world. The first major event is the take of Granada and the expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. This fulfilled several of the objectives of the route promotion. From the Church's side, Rome took control of all Christian worship in the Iberian Peninsula. With regard to the Christian kingdoms, they were now unified under the dual command of the Catholic monarchs. The destruction of the Muslim threat and the expansion of Christian kingdoms at their expense was accomplished. So all the political and religious goals had been achieved. Nevertheless, that same year, a second event will happen, and its side effects will be catastrophic. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, inspired by the accounts of Marco Polo, proposed an expedition to the Catholic monarchs to try and reach China and India by sailing west, with the idea of re-establishing the flow of luxury goods to Western Europe. This expedition failed in its original objective, would accidentally arrive on the American continent, and from which he returned with enormous riches, which would begin the era of exploration. This is going to cause negative effects for the Camino de Santiago for two reasons. First, the resources and some of the workforce directly or indirectly connected to the Camino, like the fortune seekers, sailors, and recently unemployed soldiers, were attracted to this unique opportunity to get rich, which pulled economic energy away from the route. Secondly, the gold and silver brought from America would trigger a terrible inflationary crisis. These new riches caused the prices of all goods, including food, which is already becoming scarce because of the bad weather, to multiply by 6 over the next 150 years. The Spanish industry suffered enormously because it couldn't compete with foreign prices, and the importation of cheaper products would make entire sectors collapse, which would create even more poor people, more poverty, and more hunger. Many of these new poor people, in this case Spaniards, facing the lack of options and opportunities, are going to seek refuge in the hospitality of the Camino. It must be said that despite all these negative changes, the Camino did not perish, but rather turns into a zombie, with people who would never finish their pilgrimage. This rise in the number of poor, vagrants, and criminals would make the experience less safe, damage their good reputation, and start a destructive vicious cycle. As more impoverished people enter the Camino, it increased the pressure on pilgrim hospitals and reduced private economic activity. Some merchants along the way, since they were not generating as much income, decided to change their trade and perhaps venture into the Americas, which caused fewer services to be offered, which allowed existing services to increase prices, not counting inflation. As costs rise and the renown diminishes, the flow of faithful pilgrims decreases. This leads to a proportional increase in the poor and beggars, thereby reinforcing the vicious cycle. The emergence of Protestant movement made this situation worse and sped it up. This began with Martin Luther's 1517 Manifesto, and later in 1526 with the publication of Erasmus of Rotterdam's Peregrinatio, where he satirized the church and highlighted the decline of Compostela, specifically pointing out that while there are many pilgrims there were few offerings. From this moment on, the pilgrimage to Santiago started to lose all its prestige. This led to rulings, like the one from Bern, Switzerland in 1523, where the city council ordered that they shall not receive in their homes or offer shelter to beggars from the country, the war, or Santiago, nor to street vendors, pagans, or similar people. Initially, there were efforts to attempt to protect the pilgrimage. Between 1523 and 1528, the courts of Valladolid, Toledo, and Madrid released dispositions to prevent pilgrims from being confused with vagrants. Nevertheless, from this point on until 1855, there have been countless measures against pilgrims that have only done harm to the Camino. Let's look at some. In 1534, after breaking with the Catholic Church, Henry VIII created the Church of England. Subsequently, he imposed a prohibition on travel to Compostela, and in 1536, he mandated the suppression of the monasteries and the secularization of their goods, thereby removing the structures that assisted pilgrims. This will considerably cool down the pilgrimages originating from England. As expected with the reduction of pilgrims, some hospitals were closed and repurposed. For example, in 1551, the Hospital of San Miguel in Pamplona was restructured, quoting, because of the malice of the weather. It was converted into a smaller lodging house with only 8 beds, down from the original 50, and exclusively for women. Meanwhile, other parts of the building were used to create a school and a home for orphans. In 1569, pilgrims were forbidden to stay in Compostela for more than 3 days. In 1579, facing a possible attack on Compostela by the troops of Francis Drake, Bishop Sankelment decided to hide the relics of St. James behind the altar without telling anyone, and with his death in 1602, the relics of the apostle were lost. As you can see, beyond what other authors comment, the disappearance of relics did not affect the decline of the pilgrimage. There's barely any comment left regarding the impossibility of seeing the remains after the disappearance, being the testimony of Domenico Laffi one of the few examples. Apparently, it was already impossible to visit the remains, since the closure of the crypt by Hilmirith in the 12th century. In 1499, Arnold von Harf, a German pilgrim, explicitly asked to see the relics of the apostle, and he was denied his request, offering him other relics instead. He even put into question the actual existence of those relics, with other pilgrims like Andrew Board expressing the same opinion. Another interesting detail from von Harf narration is that he appeared very discontent and disappointed with the pilgrimage experience to Santiago and with Compostela, and he claimed he only would recommend it to the poor, thieves, and murderers. His statements captured the deterioration of the pilgrim atmosphere at that time. In 1590, by order of Philip II, the pilgrimage license was created. This license had to be requested from a scribe by foreign pilgrims at the borders of Spain, presenting origin documents that proved their identity and the intention to peregrinate to Santiago. Furthermore, as part of the same ordinance, it officially banned pilgrims from wearing specific clothes and staying more than 4 leagues off the main route. Meanwhile, in France, rules were established that made pilgrimage difficult, such as those promulgated by Louis XIV in 1671 and 1687, and by Louis XV in 1717 and 1728, prohibiting pilgrimage to Santiago and other places outside his kingdom without his express license. Despite the poor reputation of the route, the first Camino guides would arise thanks to the printing press. In 1495, Hermann König von Vach, a Swiss pilgrim, published a rhymed guide with practical advice shortly after completing the pilgrimage. In 1542, Andrew Board, an English physician and monk, published the first Book of Knowledge, a travel guide that contains his 2 pilgrimages to Santiago, where he is highly critical of the myths. In 1583, Nicolas Bonfons published the New Guide of the Ways in Paris, where he described the itinerary of the Camino de Santiago through France. It's worth noting that the title of this work indicates the existence of an earlier guide. In 1625, Samuel Purchas published an English itinerary in verse, from the late 14th century by an anonymous author, found in the library of Sir Robert Cotton, for the pilgrimages to Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem. And in 1670, Domenico Laffi, a Bolognese cleric, published his book Journey to the West, which was a huge success and was used explicitly by many compatriots. Furthermore, the existence of other guides is inferred, indirectly, such as the one used by the Italian Fabrizio Ballarini in 1588, to which he refers in his own account. The guides would empower the adventurous pilgrim, who in these difficult times needed a lot of shrewdness to survive. Concerning the selection of routes, we have to say that the mini-polar era wasn't helpful for the Pyrenean routes, where glaciers regrew on the peaks. The passage through Somport was abandoned, and the Hende-Irun Pass gained popularity, as are the routes through Figueres in Catalonia, along with direct boat trips to Barcelona. In this era, Barcelona became a starting point for Italian pilgrims, as they preferred not to cross through France to avoid persecution by the Huguenots. And regarding the adventurous pilgrims, we have received a huge number of accounts from these pilgrims into our time, even though they were not published in their own era. This pilgrim had a greater desire for exploration and had no urgency to return to their home, family, and responsibilities. They are easy to spot for always avoiding the most direct route and for choosing a different route home. This adventurous trend didn't just affect the poor, it also impacted a large number of nobles and clergy. Let's look at some examples. In 1465, Leon of Rosmithil, Baron of Blatna, traveled from Prague on horseback, with a large entourage. The Baron entered Spain via Irun, passed through Bilbao, used the Mina Valley Way to reach Burgos, then Valladolid, Medina de Rioseco, Olmedo, and due to political reasons and danger to his life, decided to jump to Portugal and arrive in Santiago by the Central Portuguese Way. In 1611, Jakub Sobieski, politician and father of King Jan III, traveled on horseback from Poland. He entered Spain using the Bastanes Way to Pamplona, then reached Burgos by the French Way, then went to Valladolid and to Medina de Rioseco following the Madrid Way and jumped to Leon, passing by Mayorga de Campos. After León, he traveled north to Oviedo via the Camino de San Salvador, then to Villalba following the northern way, and to Santiago via Betanzos like Antón de Lalín. In 1717, Giacomo Antonio Naya, an Italian Carmelite inspired by the story of Laffy, began his journey in Milan and crossed the Pyrenees by Figueres, arrived in Barcelona and climbed the Catalan way of the Ebro to Logroño, and then directly to Santiago via the French way. The novelty is that he also visited Murcia and Finisterre. Also in 1717, Gian Lorenzo Buonafidevanti, a Franciscan father of Castel San Pietro, after a 20-year wait for a permit, took a boat in Genoa and arrived in Cadiz, then traveled north to Seville, then following the Guadiana River, arrived in Lisbon to travel to Santiago following the central Portuguese way. He visited Murcia and Finisterre, and to return he walked the winter way in reverse, passing through Monforte de Lemos to Villafranca del Bierzo, then through Astorga, Valladolid, El Escorial, Madrid, Zaragoza, Logroño, Santo Domingo de la Calzada, and left Spain by Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. In 1726, Guillaume Menier, a tailor from Carlepont, entered Spain by Hende, followed the interior Basque way, arriving at Santo Domingo de la Calzada, and then followed the French way to Santiago. On his way back, he traveled the north way to Oviedo, then the San Salvador way to León, made a jump to Madrid, and finally headed back onto the French way to exit Spain by Roncesvalles. In 1743, Nicola Albani, a servant and secretary of the nobility, began his pilgrimage in Naples, entered Spain by Figueres, went west following the Catalan route of the Ebro, then reached Santiago by the French way, and then returned to Italy from Lisbon. To wrap up and fully illustrate the eclectic travels of this time, we have the story of Paolo Bacci, a priest of the Duomo of Arezzo from an aristocratic family. In 1764, he traveled to Barcelona, Zaragoza, Madrid, Escorial, Aranjuez, Rabanal del Camino, and finally reached Santiago following the French way. On his way back, he followed the primitive way to Oviedo and then the northern way, passing through Santander and the Basque country. In the 19th century, important social changes began with the start of the industrial era in northern Europe. A lot of vagrants and poor people decided to settle in the big cities. Additionally, there are the first efforts to solve the problems of society by applying the scientific and technical knowledge of the Enlightenment. Regarding the Camino, the destruction of the pilgrimage was missing the final blow. Spain in the late 1700s was heavily indebted and involved in multiple armed conflicts. So in 1798, following the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain, it was decided to expropriate their goods and put them up for sale through auction with the prior permission of the Pope. These properties included the hospitals for pilgrims. This measure was repeated in 1837 by Minister Juan Álvarez de Mendizábal, reaching the assets of all regular monastic orders like Franciscans and Augustinians, following the dissolution of these orders. And in 1855 by Pascual Matos, that included the military orders, such as the Knights of Malta and the Order of Santiago, and the few assets that still belonged to the Church. The land reforms destroyed the entire system for housing pilgrims and the poor. To wrap up this video and signal the start of a new era, we can say that in 1855, Pope Pius IX called for pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela. This was the first effort by the Church to promote the Camino de Santiago in 400 years, and whose calling had no impact. In 1867, only 40 pilgrims were recorded, and in 1869, which was a holy year, 800 pilgrims arrived in Santiago. The numbers will remain that way, fluctuating between tens and a few hundreds of pilgrims per year, until 1982, when almost 2,000 people will make the pilgrimage. Around the year 850, when the remains were discovered, the Iberian Peninsula consisted of a vast Muslim domain and a handful of backward Christian territories in the north. By 1493, having finished the so-called Reconquista, the peninsula had become a collection of mighty Christian kingdoms, mostly unified under the dual command of the Catholic monarchs, fully integrated into Europe and answerable to the Church in Rome. And with the discovery of America and its vast gold reserves, these kingdoms were destined to become world powers. Logically, having achieved all the political, religious, and economic objectives, the interest in promoting and subsequently protecting the Camino faded away, allowing the route to slowly die. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. I also want to remind you again that you can find my ebook about the Camino de Santiago, Ultraya Susaya et Magia on our Ko-fi page, where I not only talk about the history of the route, but also about how to live the best possible experience. Thanks for watching and buen camino.